Picture the largest reservoir in the United States. A body of water so vast that when it was full, it held enough to submerge the entire state of Pennsylvania under a foot of water. A lake so enormous that its shoreline stretches for over 500 miles, twisting through canyons of red rock and sun-baked desert. This is Lake Mead. And right now, this giant is dying. If you stood at the Hoover Dam today and looked out over the water, you would see something that should terrify anyone living in the American Southwest. A pale, chalky ring circles the entire reservoir like a bathtub stain that never washes away. That ring is called the bathtub ring, and it marks where the water used to be. Not decades ago. Not in some distant historical era. That white line marks water levels from within living memory, and every single year, the gap between the water and that ring grows wider. Lake Mead is not just a pretty lake in the desert. It is the beating heart of an entire civilization. Roughly 40 million people depend on the water stored behind the Hoover Dam. Cities that should not exist in the middle of a desert. Farms that grow a huge share of America's winter vegetables, factories, power plants, casinos, suburbs, golf courses, and swimming pools all drink from this single source. And that source is running dangerously, historically, frighteningly low. So here is the question that keeps water managers awake at night. What happens if Lake Mead actually runs out? Not just drops a little. Not just triggers a mild shortage. What happens if this reservoir hits what engineers grimly call dead pool, the point where water can no longer physically flow past the dam? Because when that day comes, and every trend suggests it could come sooner than anyone wants to admit, the water does not disappear equally for everyone. There is a brutal, unforgiving order to who loses first. A hierarchy written in century-old legal documents that most people have never read and never think about. And in this video, we are going to walk through exactly which 7 states are tied to this shrinking lifeline, and in what order the taps run dry. Some of the answers will surprise you. Some of them might even make you angry. Because the people who use the least are not always the ones who suffer first, and the states you would expect to be protected are sometimes the most exposed of all. Stay with me until the end, because the final state on this list is the one almost nobody expects, and understanding why it is so vulnerable reveals the strange and fragile logic holding the entire American West together. Hashtag the river that built the West. To understand Lake Mead, you first have to understand the river that fills it. The Colorado River begins high in the Rocky Mountains, born from melting snow that accumulates over the long winters in Colorado and Wyoming. From those frozen peaks, the water gathers into streams, then creeks. Then a mighty river that carves its way south and west for nearly 1,400 miles. Along the way, it slices through some of the most spectacular landscape on Earth, including the Grand Canyon itself, a chasm the river spent millions of years cutting one grain of sand at a time. For most of human history, the Colorado ran wild and free all the way to the Sea of Cortez in Mexico, spilling into a lush delta teeming with birds and fish and life. But in the early 20th century, the people of the growing American West looked at this river and saw something different. They saw opportunity. They saw a way to turn desert into farmland, to power cities, to build an empire in a place where nature never intended cities to grow. And so they decided to tame it. The centerpiece of that ambition was the Hoover Dam, one of the greatest engineering achievements in human history. Built during the depths of the Great Depression, thousands of workers descended into the Black Canyon and poured enough concrete to build a highway from coast to coast. When they finished, they had created a wall of concrete more than 700 feet tall, holding back the entire Colorado River and forming the reservoir we now call Lake Mead, named after Elwood Mead, a federal official who oversaw much of the early reclamation effort. That single act of engineering changed everything. Suddenly, the unpredictable river could be controlled. Water could be stored during wet years and released during dry ones. Electricity could be generated from the falling water. And most importantly, the flow could be divided up, parceled out, and delivered to farms and cities across an enormous region. The desert bloomed. Las Vegas rose from the sand. Phoenix sprawled across the valley. Los Angeles drank deeply. Millions of acres of farmland turned green. An entire way of life was built on the promise that this water would always be there. But that promise was based on a fatal miscalculation, and to understand it, we have to go back to the year 1922. Hashtag the deal that divided a river in 1922. Representatives from 7 states gathered together to decide how to split up the Colorado River. This agreement, called the Colorado River Compact, is the foundation of everything that governs water in the West to this day. Those 7 states are the same 7 states whose fate is tied to Lake Mead, and they are the stars of our story. They are Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, and New Mexico, which together make up what is called the Upper Basin, the region where the river is born. And then there are Nevada, Arizona, and California, which make up the Lower Basin, the region where the river is consumed. The negotiators divided the river into 2 halves. The Upper Basin states agreed to deliver a certain amount of water downstream to the Lower Basin every year, and the Lower Basin states divided their share among themselves. On paper, it was elegant. Every state knew exactly how much water it was entitled to. Everyone could plan, build, and grow with confidence. But there was a catastrophic flaw baked into the entire agreement. The negotiators in 1922 measured how much water flowed down the Colorado River and used those measurements to decide how much to give each state. The problem was that the years they measured happened to be some of the wettest years in the river's entire recorded history. They assumed the river carried far more water than it actually does in a normal year. In other words, they divided up a pie that was bigger on paper than it ever was in reality. They promised more water than the river could reliably deliver, and every state built its future on that inflated promise. For decades, this flaw was hidden. There was enough water in wet years, and the reservoirs behind the dams could store the surplus to cover the dry years. Lake Mead filled up. Its sister reservoir upstream, Lake Powell, filled up too. Together they held years and years of backup supply, a giant savings account of water that the West could draw on whenever the river came up short. As long as that savings account stayed full, nobody had to face the ugly math of the original compact. But then came the drought. And not just any drought. Hashtag the megadrought that changed everything starting around the year 2000. The American Southwest entered a period of dryness so severe and so prolonged that scientists have given it a special name. They call it a megadrought. Studies of tree rings, which record centuries of climate history and their growth patterns, suggest this has been the driest stretch the region has experienced in more than 1,000 years. Not the driest in decades, not the driest in a century, the driest in over a millennium. Year after year, the snow that falls in the Rocky Mountains has been thinner than it used to be, and even when a decent amount of snow does fall, warmer temperatures mean more of it evaporates or soaks into parched ground before it ever reaches the river. The soil is so dry that it drinks up the snowmelt like a sponge, leaving less and less to flow downstream. Rising temperatures also mean more water evaporates directly off the surface of the reservoirs themselves, stealing supply straight out of the lake before anyone can use it. The result has been a slow-motion catastrophe. That giant savings account of water, the reservoirs that were supposed to protect everyone from dry years, began to drain. Lake Mead and Lake Powell dropped and dropped and dropped. At its fullest, Lake Mead sat at an elevation of around 1,220 feet above sea level. Over the course of the megadrought, it plunged more than 150 feet, sinking to levels never seen since the reservoir was first being filled back in the 1930s. At the lowest points, the lake fell to barely a quarter of its total capacity. 3/4 of the water that was supposed to be there was simply gone. As the water fell, it revealed things that had been hidden for decades. Sunken boats emerged from the depths. Long-lost objects surfaced from the mud. Human remains, victims of long-ago crimes, were exposed as the shoreline retreated. Marinas that once floated on deep water found themselves stranded on dry land, forced to relocate again and again as they chased the shrinking lake downhill. The whole reservoir became a kind of grim museum, each new discovery a reminder of just how far the water had fallen. And here is the part that should worry everyone. There is a point, far down near the bottom of the dam, where the water level gets so low that it can no longer flow through the intakes that feed the turbines and canals. First, the dam loses its ability to generate electricity, cutting off power to hundreds of thousands of homes. And then, if it keeps falling, the reservoir reaches dead pool, the level at which water physically cannot pass beyond the Hoover Dam at all. At dead pool, the river below the dam essentially stops. Everything downstream that depends on that water is cut off completely. It is the nightmare scenario, the point of no return, and the megadrought pushed the lake closer to it than it has ever been. So now we arrive at the central question. As the water falls toward that catastrophic point, who loses it first? Because the answer is not simple, and it is not fair, and it is governed by a principle that most people have never heard of. Hashtag the brutal rule of who goes first in the American West. Water rights follow a principle with a deceptively simple name. It is called prior appropriation, and the phrase that sums it up is first in time, first in right. What it means is this: whoever started using the water earliest has the strongest, most senior claim to it, and whoever came later has a junior claim. When there is not enough water to go around, the junior users get cut off first, all the way down to zero if necessary, before the senior users lose even a single drop. Think of it like a line of people waiting to fill their buckets from a well that is running dry. The people at the front of the line, the ones who got there first 100 years ago, are guaranteed their full bucket even if the well is almost empty. The people at the back of the line, the ones who showed up more recently, may find that by the time it is their turn, there is nothing left. It does not matter how much they need it. It does not matter how many people depend on them. It does not matter if they are a giant city or a struggling farm. The only thing that matters is where they stand in that line, and that position was largely decided decades ago. This principle, combined with the Colorado River Compact and a whole stack of laws, court rulings, and agreements collectively known as the Law of the River, determines the exact order in which our 7 states lose their water. So let us count down through them, from the state that gets hit first and hardest, all the way to the state that is protected the longest. And keep in mind, when we talk about Lake Mead specifically, we are talking about the water that serves the 3 lower basin states most directly, because Lake Mead sits below the point where the river is divided. But the fate of all 7 is bound together, because if the system collapses, no one escapes untouched. Hashtag number 1. Arizona takes the first and hardest blow the first state to lose water, and the one that loses the most is Arizona. And the reason why is a heartbreaking story of bad timing and political compromise. Arizona is home to one of the most ambitious water projects ever built, an enormous canal system called the Central Arizona Project. This aqueduct stretches for over 300 miles across the desert, lifting water uphill from the Colorado River and carrying it all the way to Phoenix and Tucson, the 2 largest cities in the state. Millions of people and vast stretches of farmland depend on the water flowing through that canal. Without it, Central Arizona as we know it could not exist. But here is the cruel twist. When Arizona was fighting to get this project approved and funded back in the mid-20th century, California, the powerful neighbor next door, had enormous political leverage, and California drove a hard bargain. In exchange for allowing the Central Arizona Project to be built, Arizona was forced to accept a junior priority. That means Arizona agreed to stand near the back of the line. When shortages hit, Arizona would be the first to take cuts, and it would absorb those cuts to protect California's supply. At the time, it must have seemed like an acceptable trade. Shortages were a distant, theoretical worry. But now, that worry has become reality. As Lake Mead has fallen, the federal government has declared official shortage conditions, and each time it does, Arizona bears the heaviest reductions of any state. Hundreds of thousands of acre-feet of water, each acre-foot enough to supply a couple of households for a year, have already been stripped from Arizona's allocation. The cuts have fallen most heavily on farmers, particularly in the central part of the state, who have watched fields that fed their families for generations go dry and turn to dust. Some have torn out crops. Some have drilled desperately for groundwater. Some have simply given up. So Arizona is the canary in the coal mine. When the water falls, Arizona feels it first, and Arizona feels it hardest. If Lake Mead truly ran out, Arizona's connection to the Colorado River, that lifeline canal snaking across the desert would run dry before almost anyone else's. Hashtag number 2, Nevada. The smallest share and the cleverest survivor, the second state on our list, is Nevada. And Nevada's story is one of both extreme vulnerability and remarkable ingenuity. Here is the astonishing fact about Nevada. Of all 7 states that share the Colorado River, Nevada was given by far the smallest allocation. When the water was divided up, Nevada received only a tiny sliver of the total, a fraction of what California or Arizona got. Back in the 1920s, Nevada was a sparsely populated desert state, and nobody imagined that a glittering metropolis of millions would one day rise from the sand near the river. So Nevada was handed a share that seemed generous at the time and is now almost comically inadequate for the population it must serve. Nearly all of that share flows to a single place, the Las Vegas Valley. And Las Vegas draws its water directly from Lake Mead itself, sucking it out through massive intake pipes. This is what makes Nevada so uniquely exposed. Las Vegas does not just depend on the Colorado River in some abstract legal sense. It depends physically, directly, and almost entirely on the water sitting inside that one shrinking reservoir. If Lake Mead drops too low, the intake pipes could be left sucking air. And this is exactly the danger that Las Vegas saw coming, which brings us to the ingenuity. Water managers in southern Nevada understood that their old intake pipes were positioned relatively high up in the reservoir, and that if the lake fell far enough, those pipes would be left high and dry above the waterline. So they undertook a staggering engineering project. They drilled a brand new intake, sometimes called the third straw, deep beneath the reservoir. This new intake draws water from near the very bottom of the lake. They even built a pumping station designed to keep pulling water out even if Lake Mead falls all the way to dead pool. In other words, Las Vegas engineered itself so that it could keep drinking right down to the last possible drop. Nevada has also become one of the most water-conscious places in the entire country. The region recycles a huge portion of the water used indoors, treating it and returning it to the lake, which then counts back toward its allocation. It has banned decorative grass, paid residents to rip out their lawns, and cracked down on waste with an intensity found almost nowhere else. So while Nevada is physically the most exposed to Lake Mead, its small footprint and aggressive conservation mean it has fought hard to survive a crisis. Still, make no mistake, if the lake dies, Las Vegas is standing at the water's edge, more directly dependent on Lake Mead than any other city on Earth. Hashtag number 3, California. The giant that hides behind old paper, the third state, is California. And California is the most fascinating case of all, because California is simultaneously the biggest user of Colorado River water and one of the best protected from cuts. California takes the largest share of the Colorado River of any state by a wide margin. That water irrigates one of the most productive agricultural regions on the planet, a place called the Imperial Valley in the far southeast corner of the state. In this blistering desert, where summer temperatures routinely soar past 110 degrees, Colorado River water has transformed the sand into a green paradise that grows an enormous portion of the vegetables Americans eat during the winter months. Lettuce, broccoli, carrots, and more, all growing in a place that receives almost no rainfall, made possible entirely by the river. Colorado River water also flows to the coastal cities of Southern California, helping to slake the thirst of the Los Angeles and San Diego megaregion. You might assume that because California uses the most, it would have the most to lose. But here is where that brutal rule of first in time, first in right, comes roaring back. The farmers of the Imperial Valley hold some of the oldest and most senior water rights on the entire river. They started diverting Colorado River water more than a century ago, long before Phoenix boomed, or Las Vegas lit up its first casino. That means they stand right at the front of the line. Under the priority system, California's senior rights are so strong that Arizona and Nevada must be cut all the way down before California loses much of anything at all. This creates one of the great tensions in the entire drama of the Colorado River. A single agricultural district in California holds a claim to more water than the states of Arizona and Nevada combined. And that claim is legally protected ahead of the drinking water for millions of city dwellers. It is a situation that strikes many people as deeply unfair and it has fueled endless negotiations, lawsuits, and political fights. California has agreed to some voluntary reductions to help keep the system from collapsing entirely, because everyone understands that if the whole thing crashes. Even senior rights become worthless when there is simply no water left. But in the strict order of who loses first, California, despite being the thirstiest state of all, is shielded by the power of old paper signed generations ago. It is one of the last to feel the pain, not because it uses the least, but because it got there first. Hashtag the Upper Basin. Where the water is born now, we cross the invisible line that divides the river, and we turn to the 4 states of the Upper Basin. These are Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, and New Mexico. Their relationship to Lake Mead is different, and understanding that difference is key to understanding the whole crisis. Remember, Lake Mead sits in the lower basin, below the dividing point. The Upper Basin states do not drink directly from Lake Mead. Instead, they use the water higher up, closer to where the river is born in the mountains, before it ever reaches the great reservoir. Their water is stored mainly in Lake Powell, the other giant reservoir upstream. So why are these 4 states part of our story at all? Because of that original compact from 1922. The Upper Basin made a legal promise to deliver a set amount of water downstream to the lower basin every year. And keeping that promise, in an era when the river is shrinking, is becoming an almost impossible burden. Here is the trap the Upper Basin finds itself in. When the river runs low, they still owe that delivery downstream. If they cannot meet their obligation using the natural flow of the river, they may be forced to release water from their own reservoir, Lake Powell, to make up the difference and keep water flowing to the lower basin and to Lake Mead. In effect, the Upper Basin could be drained to protect the lower basin, and that possibility hangs over Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, and New Mexico like a sword. Legal experts and water managers have argued for years about what exactly would happen if the Upper Basin simply could not deliver the required water. It is one of the great unresolved questions of the entire system. A legal time bomb that nobody wants to be the one to detonate. So let us continue our countdown, moving into the Upper Basin, where the pain arrives in a different form. Hashtag number 4, New Mexico. The vulnerable corner of the 4th state on our list is New Mexico. New Mexico is an Upper Basin state, but it sits in a precarious position, drawing on a portion of the Colorado River system through tributaries and diversions that serve communities and farms in the northwestern part of the state, as well as through a connected project, the region around one of its major cities. New Mexico is one of the driest states in the entire country to begin with. It has very little water to spare from any source. So every drop from the Colorado system matters enormously. Because it is an Upper Basin state, its supply depends heavily on how much snow falls in the mountains each winter, and those snowpacks have been shrinking. When the Upper Basin as a whole is squeezed, either by drought or by the pressure to deliver water downstream. States like New Mexico, with smaller allocations and less storage of their own, can find themselves stretched dangerously thin. It is a state living close to the edge, where a couple of bad winters in a row can turn a difficult situation into an emergency. Hashtag number 5, Utah. Growth on a shrinking supply, the 5th state, is Utah, and Utah embodies a dangerous contradiction. It is one of the fastest growing states in the entire nation, with booming cities and sprawling new suburbs, and yet it depends on a share of a river that is delivering less and less every year. Utah draws Colorado River water to help supply its growing population and its agriculture, particularly in the southern and eastern parts of the state. As an Upper Basin state, Utah shares in that legal obligation to send water downstream, which means that even as its own cities demand more, it faces pressure to consume less so that the collective Upper Basin promise can be kept. This tension between explosive growth and shrinking supply makes Utah's long-term position genuinely fragile. The state has long discussed ambitious projects to pull even more water from the system to fuel its expansion, plans that have grown increasingly controversial as the river has declined. Utah is essentially betting on a future of abundance, while the river warns of a future of scarcity, and that gamble grows riskier with every dry year. Hashtag number 6, Wyoming. The high and quiet headwaters, the 6th state, is Wyoming, a place many people would never associate with the Colorado River at all. But Wyoming sits high in the mountains where much of the river's water originates, and it holds a share of the Upper Basin allocation. Wyoming uses its portion largely for agriculture and ranching in the western part of the state, supporting the cattle and hay operations that have defined its economy for generations. Because it is so high up in the watershed and relatively lightly populated, Wyoming is somewhat insulated from the direct, dramatic shortages that hammer a place like Arizona. Its water comes from the snow on its own mountains before that snow ever becomes the Great River downstream. But Wyoming is not immune. It, too, is bound by the compact and shares in the Upper Basin's collective duty to deliver water to the states below. If the crisis deepens and the Upper Basin is forced to curtail its own use to meet that downstream obligation, even the quiet ranches of Wyoming could feel the tightening grip. Wyoming may be far from Lake Mead, but it is still tethered to the same fraying rope as everyone else. Hashtag number 7 Colorado, the birthplace with the deepest stakes. And finally, we arrive at the 7th state, the one whose position is perhaps the most surprising of all. Colorado. This is the state where the river is born, the state that gives the river its very name. And you might think that the state at the top of the watershed, the state where the snow first melts into the streams that become the mighty Colorado, would be the safest of all. In some ways it is. But in other ways, Colorado carries the deepest and most complicated stakes in the entire system. Colorado contributes more water to the river than any other state. The snows of the Colorado Rockies are the single greatest source of the flow that eventually fills both Lake Powell and Lake Mead. The state uses its share for sprawling agriculture on its western slopes, for the growing cities along the Front Range near Denver, and for countless mountain communities. But here is the profound vulnerability. As an Upper Basin state, and as the largest contributor of water, Colorado is bound most tightly to that legal promise to deliver water downstream. If the day ever comes when the Upper Basin cannot meet its obligation to the Lower Basin, the pressure to cut back would fall heavily on the states that use the most Upper Basin water, and Colorado is chief among them. This is why Colorado, the birthplace of the river, sits at the strange and uneasy end of our list. It is not that Colorado's taps would run dry tomorrow if Lake Mead emptied. It is that Colorado, more than any other Upper Basin state, would be forced into the most wrenching decisions about how to keep the entire century-old system from collapsing. The state that starts the river could be forced to sacrifice its own growth and prosperity to keep the promise made in 1922, a promise built on water that no longer exists. Colorado holds the headwaters, but it also holds the heaviest share of the moral and legal weight. And if the negotiations among all 7 states ever break down completely, it is here, at the very source, that the fiercest battles over the future of the West may ultimately be fought. Hashtag when the system reaches the breaking point, so now you can see the shape of the whole thing. 7 states, 1 river, and a shrinking reservoir at the center of it all. Arizona and Nevada, drinking directly and most vulnerably from Lake Mead, absorbing the first and hardest cuts. California, the giant, protected by the ancient power of senior rights. And the 4 Upper Basin states, Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, and New Mexico, bound by a promise to keep the water flowing downstream even as their own supply dwindles in the mountains where the whole river begins. But what would actually happen if Lake Mead truly hit Deadpool? If the water fell so low that nothing could pass the Hoover Dam? The consequences would ripple far beyond the people who live in these 7 states. Remember that this region grows a huge portion of the winter vegetables for the entire country. Grocery stores from coast to coast would feel it. Prices would spike. Certain foods might vanish from the shelves for months at a time. The economic engine of cities like Phoenix and Las Vegas, which together generate hundreds of billions of dollars in economic activity, would seize up. Millions of people could face restrictions on the most basic use of water, and the loss of hydroelectric power from the dam would strain the electrical grid across the West, potentially triggering blackouts in the brutal desert summers when air conditioning is not a luxury, but a matter of survival. This is why, despite all the fighting and all the competing interests, The 7 states and the federal government keep coming back to the negotiating table again and again. Everyone understands, deep down, that the priority system only protects you up to a point. Being first in line means nothing if the well is completely empty. Senior rights are worthless if there is no water to claim. In the end, the only thing that saves any of them is finding a way to use dramatically less, together, before the reservoir crosses that final threshold. They have signed agreements to prop up the lake, to pay farmers to leave fields fallow, to store extra water, and to voluntarily cut back. Some of these measures have bought precious time. A couple of unusually wet winters have also thrown the region a temporary lifeline, nudging the lake back up from its most terrifying lows. But nobody believes the crisis is over. The long-term trend still points downward. The river is still, on average, delivering less than the states have promised to take. The fundamental math has not changed since 1922. They are still trying to divide a pie that is smaller than the slices they have all been promised. Hashtag, the choice that cannot be avoided Lake Mead is more than a reservoir. It is a mirror held up to the entire American experiment in the desert West. For 100 years, human ingenuity and sheer determination allowed people to build cities and farms in a place that should have been too dry to support them. Dams, canals, and pumps bent nature to human will. But nature is now sending back a bill that has come due, and the currency it demands is water that simply is not there anymore. The 7 states tied to the shrinking lake, Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, New Mexico, Nevada, Arizona, and California, are all standing on the same sinking ground, even if some of them stand a little higher than others. Arizona feels the loss first and most sharply. Nevada clings to survival through clever engineering and fierce conservation. California hides for now behind the strength of century-old claims, and the 4 states of the Upper Basin wrestle with the impossible promise to send water downstream from mountains that are giving up less and less of their snow. The white bathtub ring around Lake Mead is not just a stain on the rock. It is a warning, written in mineral and shadow, about the limits of what any civilization can take from the natural world before the natural world takes it back. Whether the American West can rewrite its 100-year-old rules in time, whether these 7 states can learn to share a smaller river without tearing each other apart, is one of the defining questions of our era. The water is falling, the clock is ticking, and the order in which the taps run dry has already been written. The only question left is whether anyone can change the ending before we reach the bottom of the lake. Because when a giant like Lake Mead begins to die, it does not die alone. It takes a piece of everyone who ever drank from it. And the 7 states we have walked through today are simply the first in a much longer line of people who will have to answer the hardest question